The morning sun cast long shadows across the television studio as makeup artists hurried between chairs, preparing guests for what promised to be another lively episode of The View. Among the usual chaos of pre-show preparation, one figure stood perfectly still near the entrance, a tall man in the distinctive red tunic and bearskin hat of the Queen's Guard, his face a mask of professional composure. James Mitchell had served Her Majesty for 12 years, standing motionless outside Buckingham Palace through scorching summers and bitter winters, enduring tourists who poked, prodded, and mocked him while he remained statue still. Today, however, was different. Today, he was here as part of a cultural exchange segment, representing the dedication and discipline of the Royal Guard to American television audiences. The invitation had come through official channels 3 weeks earlier. The producers of The View wanted to showcase British traditions, and James had been selected not just for his exemplary service record, but for his ability to articulate the deeper meaning behind the ceremony and tradition that many Americans only saw as tourist spectacle. He had spent weeks preparing, studying the show's format, understanding the hosts' personalities, and crafting thoughtful responses about duty, service, and the honor of protecting the monarchy. What James didn't know was that Whoopi Goldberg had been having a particularly difficult week. Her latest film project had fallen through, a longtime friendship had ended badly, and she was dealing with personal health issues that she hadn't made public. When she was in this kind of mood, her usually sharp wit could turn cutting, and her natural skepticism could become outright hostility. As James waited in the green room, he reviewed his notes one final time. He wanted to convey the human side of the guards, how they were real people with families, dreams, and feelings, not just tourist attractions. He thought about his daughter Sarah, who was just starting secondary school, and how proud she was when her classmates saw him on duty during school trips to London. He thought about his wife Emma, who worked double shifts as a nurse to support their family while his military salary covered the basics. The segment was scheduled to air during the show's second half, after a cooking demonstration and a discussion about celebrity fashion mishaps. James could hear the familiar sounds of live television through the walls, the controlled chaos of cameras moving, producers whispering into headsets, and the distant murmur of audience applause. A young production assistant appeared at his elbow. "Mr. Mitchell? We're ready for you in 5 minutes. Just remember to walk naturally when they introduce you, and don't worry about the cameras, just focus on the hosts." James nodded, adjusting his uniform one final time. The red wool tunic was immaculate, every brass button polished to a mirror shine. His boots gleamed like black glass, and the white plume in his bearskin cap stood perfectly upright. He had worn this uniform thousands of times, but today it felt like armor, protection against whatever might come. The studio lights were blindingly bright as James was led onto the set. The audience applauded politely as he took his designated seat between Joy Behar and Sunny Hostin. Whoopi sat at the center of the curved desk, her expression unreadable behind her signature glasses. The other hosts smiled warmly, clearly prepared to treat this as a light-hearted cultural exchange. "Today we're joined by James Mitchell," Whoopi began, her voice carrying its familiar authoritative tone, "a member of the Queen's Guard who's here to tell us about one of Britain's most famous traditions." "James, thank you for being here." "Thank you for having me," James replied, his accent crisp and distinctly British. "It's an honor to represent the Guards and to share our story with your viewers." The conversation began pleasantly enough. Joy asked about the history of the uniforms, and James explained the significance of different regiments and their distinctive features. Sunny inquired about the training process, and James described the rigorous physical and mental preparation required to serve. The audience seemed genuinely interested, and several people could be seen taking photos with their phones. But James could sense an undercurrent of tension from Whoopi's direction. She wasn't participating in the friendly banter, instead watching him with the calculating gaze of someone looking for an opening. When Sunny mentioned how difficult it must be to stand motionless for hours, Whoopi finally spoke up. "You know what I don't understand," she said, her voice cutting through the casual conversation like a blade. "This whole thing where grown men dress up in costumes and stand around like statues while tourists take selfies. I mean, is this really what British people consider an important job in the 21st century?" The studio fell silent. The cameraman, accustomed to Whoopi's provocative comments, kept rolling, but several crew members exchanged glances. This wasn't the light cultural exchange they had planned. James felt the familiar sensation he experienced during his most challenging moments on duty. Time seemed to slow, his breathing became controlled, and his mind sharpened to laser focus. He had dealt with far worse provocation during his years of service, from drunk football fans trying to make him laugh to aggressive tourists attempting to knock off his hat. But this was different. This wasn't some random person on the street, this was a respected television host with millions of viewers, dismissing not just his job, but his entire way of life. "I can see how it might appear that way to someone unfamiliar with the tradition," James replied evenly, his voice betraying none of the emotion building inside him. "But there's quite a bit more to it than what meets the eye." Whoopi leaned forward, sensing she had found her target. "Really? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're paid to be a living mannequin in a fancy hat. I mean, let's be honest here, what exactly are you guarding? The Queen's already dead, the royal family lives behind walls with actual security, and you're standing there in a costume from the 1800s. It's like working at Disneyland, except at least Mickey Mouse brings joy to children." The audience gasped audibly. Even Joy and Sunny looked uncomfortable, with Joy touching Whoopi's arm in a gesture that clearly meant tone it down. But Whoopi was just getting started. "And another thing," she continued, her voice rising slightly, "why are we even talking about this as if it's noble? You're a grown man playing dress-up for tourists. There are real soldiers fighting real wars, real police officers protecting real people, and we're supposed to be impressed because you can stand still? My 5-year-old nephew can stand still, should we give him a uniform too?" James could feel the heat rising in his cheeks, but his expression remained perfectly composed. He thought about Sarah watching at home, probably recording the show to show her friends at school. He thought about Emma, who would be hurt by the casual dismissal of the sacrifice their family made for his service. He thought about his fellow guards, many of whom had served in combat zones before taking on ceremonial duties. "Ms. Goldberg," he said, his voice still calm but carrying a new weight, "I understand that ceremony and tradition might seem antiquated to some people. But perhaps you'd allow me to share what this uniform actually represents." "Oh, please do," Whoopi shot back, settling back in her chair with arms crossed. "Enlighten us about the deep philosophical meaning of being a tourist attraction." The other hosts were clearly mortified. Sunny was shaking her head almost imperceptibly, and Joy was making subtle hand gestures toward the control room, probably hoping they would cut to commercial. But the cameras kept rolling, capturing every moment of what was rapidly becoming one of the most uncomfortable live television exchanges in recent memory. James took a breath, gathering his thoughts. He had prepared for difficult questions, but not for outright mockery. Still, he had faced worse than this. During his service in Afghanistan before joining the Guards, he had been in situations where composure under pressure was literally a matter of life and death. This was just another test of his training, his character, and his commitment to service. "The Queen's Guard isn't just about standing still," he began, his voice steady and clear. "Many of us are active duty soldiers who have served in combat zones around the world. We've protected British interests in Iraq, Afghanistan, and other places where real bullets were fired and real lives were lost. The ceremonial duties you see are just one aspect of our service." Whoopi waved her hand dismissively. "Oh, so now it's about military service? Make up your mind, are you a soldier or a statue? Because what we see is someone standing around in a silly hat, and that's what you're famous for." "What you see," James replied, his patience beginning to show the first hairline cracks, "is someone who has taken an oath to serve something larger than himself. Whether that's protecting British personnel overseas or maintaining traditions that connect us to centuries of service and sacrifice." "Traditions?" Whoopi's voice dripped with sarcasm. "You mean like the tradition of an unelected monarchy living in luxury while regular people struggle to pay their bills? Those traditions? Or maybe the tradition of colonialism and oppression that the royal family represents? Because that's what you're really guarding, isn't it? Not people, not freedom, but a symbol of inequality." The studio audience was completely silent now, sensing that they were witnessing something unprecedented. Several people were filming with their phones, knowing instinctively that they were seeing the kind of moment that would be replayed and analyzed for years to come. James felt something shift inside him.
This was no longer just about defending his job or his uniform.
Whoopi had crossed a line from professional skepticism into personal attack, and she was using her platform to humiliate not just him, but everything he and his fellow servicemen represented. He thought about the friends he had lost in combat, about the families who had sacrificed so much, about the young guards who would see this and question whether their service meant anything at all. "Ms. Goldberg," he said, and, for the first time, there was steel in his voice, "I think you've made your position quite clear.
You see my uniform and you see something to mock. You see my service and you see something to diminish.
You see tradition and you see something to tear down."
"That's exactly right," Whoopi replied, not recognizing the warning signs in his tone.
"Because it's 2023, not 1823, and it's time people stopped pretending that silly costumes and empty ceremonies mean something important."
"You want to serve your country?
Become a teacher, become a nurse, do something that actually helps people instead of standing around like a decoration." James nodded slowly, as if considering her words.
"I see.
So you believe that service is only valuable if it meets your personal definition of what matters?
I believe that honest work is more important than playing pretend," Whoopi shot back.
James was quiet for a long moment, and the silence stretched out across the studio like a held breath. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer, but somehow more powerful than before.
"Ms. Goldberg, may I ask you something?"
"Sure, go ahead."
"When you were growing up, did you ever have anyone in your life who taught you that some things are worth standing for, even when other people don't understand why?"
The question caught Whoopi off guard. She hesitated for just a moment before answering. "Of course.
My mother taught me to stand up for what I believed in." "And, did people ever mock her for those beliefs? Did anyone ever tell her that what she cared about was silly or meaningless?"
Whoopi's expression flickered slightly.
"What's your point?"
"My point," James said quietly, "is that you're doing to me exactly what was probably done to her. You're taking something that represents honor, duty, and sacrifice to millions of people, and you're dismissing it because it doesn't fit your worldview. You're using your platform to ridicule not just me, but every person who has ever put on a uniform and sworn to serve something larger than themselves." The other hosts were transfixed. Joy had stopped fidgeting with her papers. Sunny was staring at James with something approaching admiration. Even the crew members behind the cameras had gone completely still. James continued, his voice growing stronger with each word.
"You want to know what I'm really guarding?
I'm guarding the idea that service matters.
That commitment means something.
That there are still people in this world who will stand up for principles even when it's difficult, even when it's thankless, even when people like you tell them they're wasting their time." Whoopi opened her mouth to respond, but James wasn't finished. "You see a costume, but I see a uniform that connects me to generations of men and women who died protecting the freedoms you used to mock them. You see an empty ceremony, but I see a reminder that some things are sacred, that some values are worth preserving, that some traditions carry the weight of history and sacrifice." The studio was so quiet that the hum of the air conditioning seemed loud. James could see that his words were having an impact, not just on Whoopi, but on everyone in the room. For the first time since the segment began, he felt like he was truly representing not just himself, but all the people who served with him.
"And, you want to know the real irony?"
James asked, his voice still soft but carrying across the silent studio like a bell. "While you're sitting here mocking my service, there are guards standing outside palaces and government buildings right now, protecting the very democracy that gives you the right to say these things. They're standing there in the rain, in the heat, in the cold, not because they're paid well, because they're not, but because they believe in something you apparently don't understand." Whoopi had gone very still. Her usual quick comeback seemed to have deserted her, and, for the first time in the conversation, she looked uncertain. James leaned forward slightly, his eyes never leaving hers.
"You asked me what I'm guarding, Ms. Goldberg.
I'm guarding the idea that honor still matters in a world that seems determined to tear it down.
I'm guarding the belief that service to others is more important than service to self. And, apparently, I'm guarding these values against people who should know better."
The silence stretched on, and James could feel the entire studio holding its breath. He had said what needed to be said, but
he could sense that this was just the beginning. Whatever happened next would determine not just how this conversation ended, but how the world would remember this moment. The silence in the studio stretched for what felt like an eternity but was probably only 10 seconds. In television terms, 10 seconds of dead air might as well be 10 minutes. Cameras captured every micro-expression on every face, from Whoopi's stunned stillness to the visible discomfort of the other hosts to James's unwavering composure. Behind the cameras, the control room was in chaos. The director was speaking rapidly into his headset, trying to decide whether to cut to commercial or let the moment play out. Social media managers were already fielding thousands of notifications as clips of the exchange began spreading across Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok at lightning speed. The show's executive producer stood frozen, watching the monitors and realizing that they were either witnessing a career-defining disaster or a moment of television history. Whoopi finally broke the silence, but her voice had lost its earlier bite. That's quite a speech," she said, clearly struggling to regain her footing. "But you're still just one person in a costume." "No," James interrupted, and the quiet force in his voice made everyone in the studio lean forward. It was the first time he had cut anyone off, and the simple word carried the weight of absolute conviction. "I'm not just one person. I represent thousands of people who have worn this uniform. And, when you mock me, you mock all of them." Joy Behar, sensing an opportunity to salvage the situation, tried to jump in. "I think what James is trying to say," but James held up a hand, politely but firmly stopping her. His eyes remained fixed on Whoopi's face. "I'm not finished, Ms. Goldberg. You asked me questions, and I'm going to answer them completely." The authority in his voice was unmistakable. This wasn't the deferential guest who had walked onto the set 20 minutes earlier. This was a man who had commanded troops in combat, who had faced down enemy fire, who had learned that sometimes you have to stand your ground regardless of the odds. "You mentioned my 5-year-old nephew could stand still," James continued, his voice still controlled but carrying an edge that made everyone in the room pay attention. "Let me tell you what standing still actually means in my job. It means standing motionless for 2 hours at a time in temperatures that range from below freezing to over 90 degrees Fahrenheit. It means ignoring wasps that land on your face, ignoring rain that runs down your neck, ignoring the pain in your feet and back and shoulders." Whoopi started to speak, but James's steady gaze stopped her. "It means maintaining perfect posture and alertness while tourists try to make you laugh, while they touch you without permission, while they sometimes say the most vile things they can think of just to get a reaction. It means staying focused on potential threats while people treat you like you're not human. Your nephew might be able to stand still for 5 minutes in a comfortable room. Could he do it for 2 hours in a thunderstorm while drunk football fans try to knock off his hat?" The audience was completely silent, hanging on every word. James's accent, which had seemed charming and quaint at the beginning of the segment, now carried the weight of absolute authority. He wasn't just a tourist attraction anymore, he was a soldier explaining what service actually meant. "But that's just the physical part," James continued. "The real challenge is mental. It's maintaining dignity when people try to strip it from you. It's representing something larger than yourself when others are determined to diminish it. It's staying professional when television hosts use their platform to humiliate you in front of millions of people." The last sentence hit like a physical blow. Whoopi actually flinched, and several people in the audience gasped audibly. James had just called her out directly for her behavior, not with anger or insults, but with a simple statement of fact that was somehow more devastating than any shouting match could have been. Sunny Hostin, who had been watching the exchange with growing amazement, leaned forward. "James, I think what you're describing is a lot more complex than most people realize." "It is," James agreed, briefly turning his attention to her. "And that's exactly the point. Ms. Goldberg looked at my uniform and saw everything she thought she needed to know. She didn't ask about my background, my training, or my service record. She just assumed that ceremony equals meaninglessness." He turned back to Whoopi, who was noticeably quieter than she had been just minutes earlier. "I've served 3 tours in Afghanistan, Ms. Goldberg. I've been in firefights where my decisions meant the difference between life and death for my soldiers. I've written letters to the families of men who died under my command.
I've carried the weight of responsibility for other people's lives in ways that most civilians can't imagine. The studio was so quiet that the only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioning and the barely audible whisper of camera operators adjusting their equipment. When I came back from my last deployment, James continued, his voice softening slightly, I was offered several positions in the army. I could have taken a desk job, I could have become a trainer, I could have pursued promotion to higher ranks. Instead, I requested assignment to the Queen's Guard. Why? Sonny asked, genuinely curious. Because after everything I'd seen, after all the violence and chaos and destruction, I wanted to be part of something that represented the opposite. I wanted to stand for order, for tradition, for the idea that some things in this world are worth preserving. I wanted to honor the people who died by showing that their sacrifice meant something lasting. James paused, gathering his thoughts. Every morning when I put on this uniform, I think about Sergeant Williams, who died in an IED explosion while protecting a convoy of school supplies for Afghan children. I think about Private Martinez, who was 22 years old when he took a sniper's bullet meant for a village elder who was trying to negotiate peace. I think about Lieutenant Thompson, who died throwing himself on a grenade to save his squad. The emotion in his voice was controlled but unmistakable. Several people in the audience were openly crying now, and even the camera operators were struggling to maintain their professional composure. When tourists take pictures with me, when children smile and wave, when school groups ask questions about history and service, that's when those men's sacrifice has meaning. Because I'm standing there as proof that honor still exists, that duty still matters, that some people are still willing to serve something larger than themselves. Whoopi had gone completely still. Her usual animated gestures had stopped entirely, and she was staring at James with an expression that was difficult to read. For someone who made her living with words, she seemed to have run out of things to say. You called my uniform a costume, James said, his voice growing stronger again. This uniform represents the Queen's Commission, which I earned through years of training and service. The brass buttons you mocked are polished by hand because they represent the pride we take in our appearance and our duty. The red wool you dismissed as silly is dyed the same color as the blood shed by British soldiers for over 3 centuries. He stood up slowly, his tall frame imposing even without the bearskin hat. When you mock this uniform, you're not just mocking me. You're mocking every person who has ever worn it, including the ones who died wearing it. You're mocking the families who have sacrificed their sons and daughters in service to their country. You're mocking the children who look up to us as examples of what service means. The cameras captured every angle as James straightened his tunic with precise, practiced movements. You asked me what I'm guarding, Ms. Goldberg. I'm guarding the memory of better people than either of us. I'm guarding the hope that honor and duty and sacrifice still mean something in a world that seems increasingly determined to tear down anything that requires commitment or discipline. Whoopi finally found her voice, but it was much smaller than before. I didn't mean to disrespect your military service. Yes, you did, James interrupted, and the simple honesty of the statement was more powerful than any accusation. You meant to disrespect everything about my service because it doesn't fit your worldview. You wanted to make me look foolish on national television because you thought it would be entertaining for your audience. The control room was in complete pandemonium now. Phone calls were being made to network executives, social media was exploding, and news outlets were already preparing to cover what was rapidly becoming one of the most talked about television moments of the year. James looked directly into the camera closest to him, addressing the millions of viewers watching at home. To anyone watching who has served in any capacity, military, police, fire department, emergency services, I want you to know that your service matters. Don't let anyone tell you that duty is old-fashioned or that honor is meaningless. Don't let anyone convince you that putting others before yourself is somehow wrong. He turned back to Whoopi, who was now visibly uncomfortable in a way that her years of television experience couldn't hide. And, to you, Ms. Goldberg, I want to say this, you have a platform that reaches millions of people. You have the power to inspire, to educate, to bring out the best in others. Instead, you chose to use that platform to tear down someone who dedicates his life to service. That says more about you than it ever could about me. The studio erupted in unexpected applause. It started with just 1 or 2 people in the audience, but quickly spread throughout the room. Camera operators, sound technicians, makeup artists, people who had seen thousands of television tapings, were clapping for this quiet man in the red uniform who had just delivered the most devastating takedown in live television history without raising his voice or using a single insult. Whoopi tried to speak over the applause, but her words were lost in the sound. When it finally died down, James was already moving toward the edge of the set.
"Where are you going?" Joy called out.
"I'm going back to my post," James replied simply.
"I have duty to attend to." As he walked off the set, the cameras followed his every step.
His posture was perfect, his movements precise and controlled. He looked like exactly what he was, a soldier who had just won a battle he never wanted to fight. Behind him, Whoopi sat in stunned silence while her co-hosts struggled to figure out how to transition to the next segment. The audience was still buzzing with whispered conversations, and cell phones were out everywhere as people shared videos and photos of what they had just witnessed. In homes across America, people were setting down their morning coffee and calling their friends.
"Are you watching The View right now? You need to see this."
The segment had been scheduled to last 15 minutes. It had run for nearly 30, and nobody in the control room had thought to cut it short. Sometimes, television history happens in real time, and everyone involved recognizes that they're witnessing something special. As James reached the exit, he paused and turned back one final time. "Ms. Goldberg," he called across the studio, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden quiet.
"I hope someday you meet some of the people I've served with.
I think you'd find that the men and women who dedicate their lives to service are far more remarkable than you realize." And, with that, he was gone, leaving behind a studio full of people who were still trying to process what they had just witnessed. In the control room, phones were ringing non-stop.
On social media, hashtags were trending worldwide. In newsrooms across the country, assignment editors were scrambling to find follow-up angles.
But, in the studio itself, there was just silence and the gradual realization that they had all just been part of something extraordinary. James Mitchell had walked onto the set as a curiosity, a novelty guest for a light cultural segment. He was walking out as something else entirely, a man who had reminded everyone watching what dignity looked like under pressure, what honor meant in action, and what happened when someone with nothing to prove met someone who had forgotten what service really meant. The cameras were still rolling, still capturing the aftermath of the confrontation, but the real story was already over. It had ended the moment James Mitchell decided that some things were worth standing up for, regardless of the cost. Within minutes of James Mitchell walking off the set of The View, the internet exploded. The first shaky cell phone videos appeared on social media before the show had even cut to commercial. Twitter users were posting clips with captions like "British Guard destroys Whoopi on live TV" and "the most dignified takedown in television history." TikTok creators were already editing highlight reels with dramatic music and slow-motion replays of Whoopi's stunned expressions. In the show's control room, chaos reigned. Executive producer Sarah Chen stood behind the director's chair, watching multiple monitors showing social media feeds, news alerts, and viewer reaction data streaming in real time. Her phone buzzed incessantly with calls from network executives, publicists, and news outlets wanting statements about what they were already calling the Guard incident. "How many views?" she asked the social media coordinator.
2 million in the first 20 minutes, came the breathless reply.
And climbing fast. The hashtag Royal Guard respect is trending worldwide. Sarah rubbed her temples. In her 15 years producing television, she had never seen anything go viral this quickly or this intensely. The original segment was being shared faster than the show's team could track it, and reaction videos were appearing almost as quickly as people could record them. Meanwhile, in the studio, Whoopi sat frozen in her chair as makeup artists tried to prepare her for the next segment. Her usual quick wit had abandoned her completely. The woman who had built a career on sharp commentary and fearless opinions looked smaller somehow, diminished by the encounter with the quiet man in the red uniform. "Whoopi," Joy whispered urgently, "we need to figure out how to handle this. The phones are lighting up, social media is going crazy, and we still have 40 minutes of show left." Sunny Hostin nodded toward the audience, many of whom were still filming with their phones despite repeated requests from crew members to put them away.
"Look at them.
Half of them are crying, and the other half look like they want to stand up and salute."
Indeed, the studio audience was unlike any they had seen before.
Usually, during commercial breaks, people chatted excitedly about what they had just witnessed. Now, they sat in contemplative silence, as if they were processing something profound. An elderly woman in the front row was dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, while a young man behind her was staring at the spot where James had stood with something approaching awe. Whoopi finally spoke, her voice uncharacteristically small.
I didn't know about his military service.
They didn't tell me he was a combat veteran.
You didn't ask, Sonny replied gently but firmly. You made assumptions. The truth of this hit Whoopi like a physical blow.
She was known for her preparation, for researching her guests and understanding their backgrounds. But something about the sight of the ceremonial uniform had triggered an immediate negative reaction, and she had let her preconceptions drive the conversation rather than her usual journalistic curiosity. On the other side of the studio, James Mitchell sat in the green room, checking his phone for messages from his family.
Emma had texted simply, "I'm proud of you. Sarah wants to know if you're okay."
He smiled slightly. His daughter was probably at school, but news traveled fast in the social media age. She had likely seen clips of the exchange already. A production assistant approached nervously.
"Mr. Mitchell?
There are some reporters outside who would like to speak with you.
And, Ms. Chen, our executive producer, would like to have a word before you leave." James nodded politely.
He had expected this. Controversial television moments didn't happen in isolation, there were always consequences, always follow-up questions, always people who wanted to extend the story or control the narrative.
Sarah Chen appeared a few minutes later, looking harried but professional. "Mr. Mitchell, I want to apologize on behalf of the show. That was not the kind of interview we planned or wanted."
Whoopi, well, she's having a difficult time right now, but that's no excuse.
"No apology necessary," James replied calmly. "Ms. Goldberg said what she thought. I said what I thought.
Sometimes that's how real conversations happen."
The network is concerned about potential fallout. They're wondering if you might be willing to appear on a follow-up segment tomorrow, maybe something more controlled? James considered this.
"I appreciate the offer, but I think I've said everything I need to say.
Besides, I have duties to return to." Sarah nodded, though she looked disappointed.
A follow-up appearance could have helped contain the damage and provided some positive spin for the show. Without it, they were left with the raw footage of one of their hosts being thoroughly outmaneuvered by a guest. Outside the studio building, a small crowd of reporters had indeed gathered. James could see news vans from CNN, Fox News, and several local stations parked along the street. Camera crews were setting up equipment, and producers were pacing back and forth while speaking rapidly into phones.
As James emerged from the building, still in his full guard uniform, the questions started immediately. "Mr. Mitchell, how do you feel about Ms. Goldberg's comments? Did you expect that kind of reception when you came on the show? What would you like to say to people who support your response?"
James paused at the top of the steps, looking down at the assembled media. For a moment, it seemed like he might ignore them completely and walk away. Then, he stepped up to the cluster of microphones that had been quickly assembled. "I'd like to say something about what just happened," he began, his voice carrying the same calm authority it had held in the studio. "Ms. Goldberg has the right to her opinions, just as I have the right to mine. What troubles me is not that she disagreed with what I represent, but that she felt comfortable mocking it without understanding what it actually means." The reporters scribbled notes furiously while cameras captured every word.
"I've spent my adult life in service, first in combat zones, now in ceremonial duties. Both matter.
Both require sacrifice. Both deserve respect, even if you don't agree with the institutions they represent. When we stop respecting service, when we stop honoring duty and commitment, we lose something essential about what makes a society function." A reporter from CNN raised her hand. "Mr. Mitchell, there are people on social media calling you a hero for standing up to Ms. Goldberg.
How do you respond to that?"
James shook his head slowly.
"I'm not a hero." heroes are the people who died protecting others. I'm just a man who believes that some things are worth defending, even when it's uncomfortable. Especially when it's uncomfortable. What about calls for Ms. Goldberg to apologize? Another reporter asked.
That's between her and her conscience, James replied.
I'm not looking for an apology. I'm hoping for understanding.
There are thousands of people who serve in various capacities: military, police, fire departments, emergency services, teachers, nurses, who put others before themselves every day.
They deserve better than to be mocked for their commitment.
Meanwhile, back in the studio, The View was attempting to continue with their regular programming, but the energy in the room had completely changed.
Whoopi seemed distracted and subdued during the remaining segments.
Joy and Sunny kept exchanging glances, clearly aware that they were part of something that would be talked about for years to come.
The show's final segment was supposed to be a lighthearted discussion about summer vacation plans.
Instead, it became an impromptu conversation about respect, service, and the responsibility that comes with having a platform. I think we all learned something today, Sunny said carefully, clearly trying to address the elephant in the room without reopening wounds. Sometimes our assumptions about people can blind us to their actual stories.
Joy nodded.